for graphic design practice, and within a quite broad graphic design course, I'm able to I'm fortunate enough to work with letterpress and have access to facilities within the Northumbria University campus. I began a part-time PhD research project in 2015, which seems like a long time ago now. It's coming towards the end. And that's been exploring the use of technology in broad terms within contemporary letterpress practice. To gather insights into creative practice using letterpress, I've completed interviews with practitioners. It's taken me all around Europe. It's been an interesting adventure. I've also conducted and recorded my own reflective practice, where I've been putting some of the ideas that have come from those practitioners into my own work, exploring the techniques that they're using and the technologies. And I've also recorded a print exchange, which is what I'm going to focus this short presentation on. Hopefully short presentation. Stop me if I start to overrun. So, as I say, I'm kind of writing up the PhD at the moment, so untangling this one aspect from the thesis that's mostly in my head at the minute is an interesting challenge. But when we talk about post-digital letterpress, it's still quite emergent, I would say. And I'll give you my view and my perspective on what I want to talk to when I'm talking about post-digital letterpress. So when studying the use of technology in contemporary letterpress practice, the integration of digital technologies with traditional letterpress techniques arose very much as a prevalent phenomenon within creative practitioners' work, within the work that's being shared with the communities as well. And this increased popularity of letterpress printing and printed artifacts that we see as prevalent throughout our popular culture now, to me is a trend that I think belies a greater movement of post-digital activity and values that are coming more to the fore. A combination of digital fatigue, creative experimentation, technological appropriation, and reappraisal of traditional production, to me, has coalesced to form contemporary communities of practitioners who place equal value on the digital and analog technologies that were once viewed popularly as a dichotomy between the old and the new, the digital and the analog, something that we've addressed in a couple of talks already today. This is my perspective of post-digital letterpress. My research is undertaken using a practice lens, so very much looking at the tools and technologies people use and how they use them to express themselves and engage with their work in the world. And I've been examining practitioners' use of technology within their creative practice to try to better understand what we might mean by post-digital letterpress and what it might become. So, getting onto the exchange itself, the post-digital letterpress print exchange, as it came to be called, came about having completed my semi-structured interviews and developed my reflective practice portfolio, which was ongoing throughout the active research portion of my PhD research. I became aware of the need to improve my understanding of letterpress practitioners' use of technology, both within their individual practice and as a community. I'd spoken to people across presses and across coffee tables, and I'd taken what they told me and case studies and applied it to my own work, but I felt that there was a need for me to have a better understanding with more detail from more than just verbatim, but a need for a way of recording and gathering information that actually told me about the motivations and the practices that were going on when the workshop door closed and the annoying PhD researcher had gone away. What were people actually doing and what were they thinking? So how could I get access to that? So approaching this, the imperative to kind of uncover that detail of information, it's led me to co-opt the established model of a print exchange. If you're not familiar with that, I'll go into a bit more detail. But I'd engaged with a few print exchanges, portfolio swaps, and I felt that could be used as a catalyst to gathering the data that I was so much in need of. So approaching the project as a researcher practitioner, it allowed me to identify that print exchange model and then apply it as an instrument for data collection. The focus of the exchange was not the resulting artwork itself, but its outcome is a visual and textual material that can be analysed and then used to contribute towards theories, hypotheses, and my own academic ideas and thinking. So the exchange itself was launched at Letterpress Workers 2017. There's some Letterpress workers here, but for those of you who aren't aware, it's a fantastic annual meeting of letterpress workers, people, printers, people who are interested in letterpress and printing, and loads of energy and a really special community of people who are very open to sharing ideas, technologies. It's a wonderful event if you're able to get to it. But it was a perfect place to launch my invitations because they could then travel across Europe and the world further afield. And I asked practitioners to take away a small pizza box that had this invitation on it, which could then contain the prints that they'd send back to me. So printers who create original printed artwork using both traditional and digital technologies were invited to take part. And among the invitees were artists, designers, printers, but they all employ letterpress as a core aspect of their practice. Looking at the invitation, you can just see there's a bit of detailing there. That was the invitation they were given with a bit more detail inside. But the invitation itself included a questionnaire along with a call for them to produce some printed artwork. And that's something that they were already familiar with, but it had been leveraged to try and elicit more detail of information about their practice as well as the image itself. So it was introduced in the form of open questions that were intended to prompt participants to respond by creating printed artwork in addition to completing the questionnaire on the subject of their practice, post-digital, how they view letterpress, how it's changed, and why they continue to print with this technique. So the exchange was specifically designed to document the digital and analog technologies being used by contemporary letterpress practitioners and further understanding of these technologies. So if you can see in the diagram, it's the clearest I could make this. And it makes me a bit dizzy thinking about collating all of these things. But essentially everyone involved would produce their 30 prints, they'd post them in, I would distribute them and collate them, and then they would be returned so that each portfolio, which is the result at the end of the process, documents each participant's work and acts as a repository of the community's response to the project that was initiated. So that then very much acts as a corpus of data for me, the researcher, that I was able to analyse and try to unpick what was going on to understand a little bit better the phenomenon of post-digital letterpress. Submission-wise, I was thrilled to receive an edition, 30 prints from 12 participants, get it right. And they came back in this box, so you can see the collection, and I'll show you each of the prints as we go through. So the exchange was successful in collecting a diverse range, all on that theme. The exchange portfolios act as artifacts that document the collective creativity, skill, and personal motivations shared by the community of practice. I've employed constructivist grounded theory to analyse the portfolio and try to elicit meaning through the analysis of both the questionnaire responses and the printed artworks themselves. And I did that by comparing the emergent codes and categories that came from that process, which I'll unpack a little bit shortly. So you can see 4 of the works there. And so written descriptions of the artworks were created. So in order to combine the textual data with the visual, I needed to get them into a similar format. So descriptions were generated of each of the artworks describing their physical appearance and qualities, as well as their kind of conceptual meaning, which was derived from and interpreted by myself, but also from the additional information that came through the questionnaires and written responses from the practitioners. So I went then through a process of coding and constant comparison, trying to get some meaning and elicit initial ideas and hypotheses from this. And you can see there's a broad range. It wasn't just prints themselves. There's very traditional approaches taken, but a lot of these more traditional blocks use laser cut, engraved, 3D printed. There's also works that employ audio artwork and packaging, photopolymer used as an actual form of displayed artwork. All a really interesting use, and it was quite a surprise how much practitioners were aware of the message presented by the materials that they chose. The processes and materials and materiality was incredibly well conceived and brought to the fore by each of the submissions. So it wasn't something that was a second-hand or a secondary consideration to them at all. It was very much had the same priority as the visual interpretation that was intended. So emergent findings are focused around the following areas: the application of technology to construct a design, and the facilitation of the design process using letterpress techniques, and the constraints of letterpress being used as a catalyst for creativity. And I'll unpack those a little bit. So, with an example by Thomas Gravemacher on the right-hand side, where he's explaining 3 of his reasons that he really likes letterpress printing, why he loves it, why he chooses to print in it, which used a brand new laser cut, laser engraved wooden block. This talks to this idea of building a form. So this comes in vivo from the data as a term. And there's a whole thematic weight behind this idea of constructing a novel design by hand, which seems relatively obvious at first point, but the more you dig into it, interrogate it, the more interesting things come to the fore, in my view. So there's an idea of linking the hand to ideas of immediacy and control, provided through a physical resistance. So a lot of people have already spoken about how you have to think things through, think ahead within the letterpress process. People are speaking to that as a real asset. So some of the quotes here that come from correspondence and from the questionnaires that were sent through, this idea of that you physically build a form. It's an object that you print with it, that tangible, tactile haptics. Typography as two-dimensional architecture, this translation of the 3D into 2D, and how that there's a form of kind of hyper-real interaction going on there. And then finally, when you have something in your hand, you know you're there. So that idea of being in an immediate sense of bodily relationship with what you're working with. That very much an antithesis of some of the ideas around virtual craft. So a third core theme that's come out of this analysis is the idea of, slightly controversially at first, that printing is boring. But the people I speak to that are really pushing and engaging the craft of letterpress in its practice, they're designers first and printers second. It's the practice of creating something using letterpress that they're engaged with, but they're not interested in jobbing printing when it comes to the letterpress. It's that idea of applying the technology to focus and direct a specific design process. They love letterpress, they love using it, but they don't want to be a printer. It's this idea of, in some ways, that the design process that's dictated to you is something that you can leverage to advance your ideas and your thinking, and that achievement of overcoming the battle with the technology that is something that's striving people and attracting them to the technique itself. And then finally, although there's no hierarchy to these, is this notion of playing within the rules. And someone mentioned the idea of being taught how to print properly. That was one of the questions that I kind of was tripping up people when I was interviewing. It was kind of, what makes a good print? And it's a very controversial thing. But there is a set form of rules in terms of how you print. You're limited by your type height, the fact that it is a relief process. There are certain ways in which letterpress process channels you and your creativity, and you have to work in certain ways for it to work effectively. But there's very much an embracing of those, what I call creative constraints, and using them to actually advance the creative process and challenging oneself to create a successful design, and that the resistance you get and the process that's laid out for you is actually a way of ensuring a certain quality and a certain approach and success in the overall work that's created by the community and practitioners. So there's mention here of there's nothing else involved. You've got what's in front of you. You know where you are. You've got limited resources, so the idea of being out of sorts comes into ideas of problem solving, overcoming the physical restrictions that are placed in front of you, and enjoying that, engaging with it. A fight between you, the machine, letters, and every part of the process. So a conflict which is kind of a pressure that's constructive as well as restrictive. I really like this idea of being stranded on an island and making your own shelter. There's kind of a MacGyver-esque way of, right, how do I achieve this idea, bring it across, and kind of designing on the press bed, which kind of runs against any kind of production form of training. There's a kind of a back and forth between the technique and the person who's engaging with it that fuels and actually channels the outcome itself. So application and implications. So to me, engaging with an exchange generates insights in collaboration with the practitioners. There's no way I could have gathered the data and insights I've got without that community and being part of it and engaging with it. So by being part of it, I could identify the exchange as an opportunity to elicit information from them. I think further practice-based research can apply and develop this model in different ways. It could be adapted and co-opted and explore other forms and aspects of practice, not just within print, obviously. And these overall findings, which come from the exchange itself, will contribute to my large PhD project exploring, in broader terms, the relationship between creative practice and technology, but in a lot more words and taking a lot more time. So that PhD will be out later this year, ideally. And I hope I've been able to unpack that without too many flowery words, and it makes sense to you. So thank you very much for listening. And